Hello and welcome to Unit 3. We've made it. So the final unit in Lab of BIO121 is looking at the skeleton. So we're going to start with the skull. So this week we'll be going through all the structures of the skull. So if you have your skull as we go through these, it's going to be really beneficial to be looking at those structures while we talk about them. Also, it will help you to use anatomy and physiology to best prepare for the practical. So I'm going to go straight down your structures list and point out all of the structures that you are expected to know. All right, we're going to start with the cranial bones. So just a little bit about the skull. It's composed of 22 bones, 8 cranial bones, and 14 facial bones. So the cranial bones are going to make up this cranial vault here where the brain is kept. And then the facial bones will make up the face. Okay, so our first bone is the frontal bone. So that's remember the frontal region is the region of the forehead. So this is this bone highlighted in blue here. And there's one structure we need to know on the frontal bone, and that is the supraorbital foramen. Okay, so if you haven't gone through the lecture material yet, you might not recognize this term, foramen. So in lecture, we're going to talk about all these bony markings and what they translate into. And one of them is foramen. Foramen means hole. Okay, so throughout this video, we're going to see a lot of foramen. And a foramen is just a little hole or passageway that a nerve or artery or something's going to be passing through. Okay, so a lot of times they're named for their location or they're named for what's passing through them. So in this case, we have the supraorbital foramen. Okay, so supra means above, orbitals saying the orbit or the eye, and foramen is saying hole. So if we look, there are these little holes in the skeleton right above the orbit, and these are the supraorbital foramen. So I've enlarged this image over here so we can really see those foramen. Moving on, we have 2 parietal bones. So if we're looking at the skull face on, and we tilt it forward so we're looking at the top of the head, here we can see 2 parietal bones. Okay, so they're making up the sides of this cranial vault. So on the images, right, we have 2 parietal bones, one on each side. This is going to be the frontal bone that we were just looking at. And now we can see our 2 parietal bones. So here's one, and here's one. If we're looking at a side view of the skull, so again, let me get the black highlighter. Here's that frontal bone that we were just looking at, and now we're talking about the parietal bones. So we can only see one since we're just looking at one side, but we can highlight this parietal bone here. Right, then we have 2 temporal bones. Okay, so think of, right, if you give yourself a nice little massage on the temples, you're touching your temporal bone. Okay, so it's the bone in this image highlighted in blue. And there's one on each side. So if you turn your skull, we have one temporal bone right here. And then on the other side, our other temporal bone. Okay, so let's just outline our temporal bone here. We're just going to look at one to start identifying these structures. Okay, so we have our temporal bone. So if you take a look at that, the first thing you're going to see that's a really easy structure to identify is the external auditory canal or external auditory meatus. Okay, so this is our ear hole. Okay, so auditory as in hearing, so you can think of the ear, and there's this hole right here, which is the external auditory canal or external auditory meatus. So we're going to skip the two foramen here because we're going to see those on an inferior view of the skull. But we can go on and look at our two processes. So we have a styloid process and a mastoid process. Okay, so styloid, think stiletto. Okay, like a high heel. Okay, so a stiletto or a stylus that you use to write on your cell phone, right, is this really pointy projection, or if we're wearing stilettos, right, we have this really pointed high heel. This is my high heel, and here's the stiletto. Okay, so the really pointy process here off of our skull, this is the styloid process of the temporal bone. Okay, so I highlighted it in blue, so let's highlight this in blue as well. Okay, and then next we have our mastoid process. So mastoid, think massive, and you can palpate this. If you go right behind your ears here and push up, there's going to be a really bony structure. That's your mastoid process. So we can circle that here. It's this really big bulbous structure posterior to the styloid process. Okay, so the other structure that we're going to look at from this lateral view of the skull is the mandibular fossa. Okay, so the mandible is the jaw, this bottom jaw here. Okay, so we have the mandible, and you'll see it articulates up here with the temporal bone, and there's an indentation here. Okay, so this indentation on the temporal bone, it's just anterior to the external auditory canal. This is the mandibular fossa. Okay, so I know this is sort of a colored mess, but we're going to look at the same four structures with an increased magnification on the next slide. So let's just look at those really fast on the skull, if I can line it up. Okay, so we have an external auditory canal, and then you have this process coming off here, but if we go back, there's an indentation where the mandible is going to articulate. That is the mandibular fossa. Then we have this really big process here, the mastoid process, and moving forward, here's our really spiky styloid process. Okay, so let's look at that a little bit closer in. Okay, so now we've increased the magnification on this temporal bone. I'm just going to take a second to outline the temporal bone. Okay, and this projection coming off is part of the temporal bone. And then we'll go down, and it comes around here. So you can see all of these structures on the temporal bone. Okay, so first was our external auditory canal. So I've made the highlighting a bit smaller so we can still look at the bony structures. So that's this hole on the side of the skull going in, right where your ear would be. Then our styloid process is this spiky projection coming off of the temporal bone. Our mastoid process is this big, robust, massive mastoid process. And then our mandibular fossa is going to be the indentation here on the temporal bone where the mandible articulates. There are three structures remaining on the temporal bone. So we have the carotid foramen, the jugular foramen, and the internal acoustic canal. Okay, so to see both the carotid foramen and the jugular foramen, we're going to look at an inferior view of the skull. Okay, so we're looking up from the bottom, just like this image is showing us. So again, it's got the temporal bone highlighted in blue, so we can sort of use that to look on your own skull and see what you're looking at. Now remember, foramen means hole, so both of these things are going to be holes, right? The jugular foramen is where the jugular vein is going to pass through, and the carotid foramen is where the carotid artery is going to pass through. So if we increase the magnification, as you can see up in this image in the upper right corner, we can see these two holes right where we're looking at on the inferior view of the skull. So the jugular foramen, which we'll look at first, is the larger hole, and it's sort of peanut shaped. Okay, so it's hard to see on this view over here, but it's going to be right here. Okay, so if you look, there's that big hole at the base of the skull. If you look just up and lateral, there's going to be this peanut-shaped hole. So in the more magnified image, we can see it here. And this is the jugular foramen. Okay, and then if we go just anterior to that, there's another hole, which is going to be the carotid foramen. So let's make the carotid foramen red. Okay, so jugular foramen, then one step forward is the carotid foramen. Okay, so our last structure of the temporal bone is the internal acoustic canal. So to see this, we're going to have to look inside of the skull. So if you remove the skull cap and we're looking in, there's going to be this really thick portion of the temporal bone. Okay, so again, the temporal bone's highlighted in blue. So this really thick region, this is called the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Okay, so if you think of that as sort of like a mountain range, and you look at it, there's a little hole in that big, thick portion in that mountain range. There's a little cave, right? And this is going to be the internal acoustic canal. Okay, so here there are two arrows pointing to it. It's also highlighted in this blue color. So that's our last structure of the temporal bone. Okay, moving on with our cranial bones, we have the occipital bone. So if you remember from Unit 1, occipital is the region of the back of the head, so that's where we're going to find the occipital bone. If we turn it around and we're looking at the back, we have this sort of orange outline, and then this bone right here on the back. Okay, so that's what we're looking at in the image on the screen. Okay, so there are 4 structures on the occipital bone. Only one of them we can see from this posterior view. Okay, the rest we're going to have to look either at an inferior view or again inside the skull. Okay, so our structure that we can see is the external occipital protuberance. Okay, so a protuberance is going to be a big rough bump. External means it's on the outside, occipital referring to the occipital bone. So if we look on our occipital bone, there's this big bump right here. So remember, or maybe you'll see this depending on if you watch lecture first or not. So in lecture we talk about the differences between the male and female skull, and the external occipital protuberance is one marking that we can use to determine if the skull is male or female. Okay, so I'm just going to outline the occipital bone here so we can see the actual bone. And then that structure highlighted in blue, that is the external occipital protuberance. Okay, moving on to see some more structures of this occipital bone, we can look at an inferior view. So again, you want to be looking at the bottom of the skull, the inferior side of the skull. Okay, so one structure, I'll just point them out here while I've got the skull out, is foramen magnum. So remember, foramen means hole, and magnum, you can think big. So it's this really large hole. This is probably one of the easiest structures to see in the skull. Okay, it's the largest foramen in the skull. This is where the spinal cord, among other things, are going to go up into the cranial vault. Then the next structure are the occipital condyles, and those are these two smooth pads here, just lateral to the foramen magnum. So if we look at that on the image, here we've got our occipital bone, and we're sort of increasing the magnification in this upper image. Okay, so our foramen magnum, big hole, right, is going to be this structure here. Yellow is not a good color to highlight that with. We'll try red. All right, foramen magnum. Here's our foramen magnum, and up here's our foramen magnum. Okay, and then the occipital condyles, we have two. These are what are going to articulate with C1, or the first cervical vertebrae. Okay, so we have one here and here, and you can see that a lot better on this increased magnification view. Okay, so one more structure, and that is the hypoglossal canal. For that, we're going to go back into looking inside the skull. So if we take off the top and we can see inside, when you see foramen magnum there, you know that this is the occipital bone, so the structures are going to be somewhere around foramen magnum. All right, our last structure of the occipital bone are the hypoglossal canals. Okay, so if we're looking again into the skull, you can see foramen magnum, and if you look around the rim of foramen magnum, so if we travel around foramen magnum, we're going to see two little holes. Okay, so here's one, and here's another. Okay, so these are the hypoglossal canals. This is where the hypoglossal nerve, which is cranial nerve 12, is going to pass through. All right, there are two cranial bones left, the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone. So we'll start going through the sphenoid bone. So one way to see this bone is looking from an anterior view. So if we look at this upper right image, the bone that's highlighted in blue there, that is the sphenoid bone. And the other way where we can see majority of the structures is looking at a superior view. So when we look into the cranial vault, we can see the sphenoid bone. Okay, so again, it's highlighted in blue. This bone is sometimes called the bat bone. It looks sort of like a bat, and it has this really identifiable structure that's sort of dead center in the skull. Okay, so the sella turcica, or hypophyseal fossa, is the term for this saddle-like looking structure here. Okay, so there's a little cup-like structure that looks like a saddle. Okay, so sella turcica translates into Turkish saddle, so that's what we can call this structure. Or we can call it the hypophyseal fossa, because this is where the pituitary gland hanging off of the brain sits. So looking from an anterior view, when we're looking at the skull, we can see one structure, and that is the superior orbital fissure. Okay, so a fissure is a crack or a groove So when you look back into the orbits, we can see it almost looks like an X through the orbits. And these upper dash marks of the X, these are going to be the superior orbital fissures. So if we look at the other image that's a little closer, right here, we can see our superior orbital fissures. There we go. Okay, so all the way back in the orbit, sort of the top of that X. So moving on through the sphenoid bone, we said this bone looks sort of like a bat. Okay, so it's the bat bone, right? And bats have wings. So, all right, so this is my little map of the foramen in the sphenoid bone. So first I'm just going to talk you through the map, and then we'll look at the image of the actual bone. So when we're looking at that superior view, so we're looking in, we can see our sella turcica. Okay, so I've drawn that in red and labeled it sella turcica, and we're going to sort of talk through some structures that we see, and then look at them on the images. Okay, so right under the lesser wing, we're going to notice these two holes. Okay, so these are the optic canal. I'm just going to put OC for optic canal. And then under the ledge of the lesser wing, there's this fissure. Okay, and if you look through the front, we talked about this fissure already at the back of the orbit. It's a superior orbital fissure. So if you take a pipe cleaner or something and put it through the superior orbital fissure, you can see that it goes through. So we're just looking at it from the other side. Okay, so superior orbital fissure. Okay, then we have this arrangement of three foramen sort of in this diagonal row going straight down. Okay, so this is Ross. Okay, our friend Ross from Friends, the paleontologist, right? He's here in the sphenoid bone. Okay, so R is foramen rotundum, O is foramen ovale, and S is foramen spinosum. Okay, so ROS, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. Then there's just one more foramen, and it's right, if the sella turcica is a saddle and you're sitting in it, it's right where your feet are going to go through. Okay, so right next to the sella turcica. Okay, so right where your feet would go through, there we go. And this is foramen lacierum. Okay, so now we're going to look at the image, and I'll point these out again, but when in doubt, draw it out, right? Drawing these maps can help you learn these structures. It doesn't have to be my map, whatever makes the most sense to you. This is how I learned it, so I like to just show this map because they're always in this sort of order. So if you know this order, it can help you learn one structure and build from there, right? Sella turcica is really easy to find, so if you know that Ross is right by the sella turcica, that's going to be easier to remember as well. All right, so here's our image. So let's identify sella turcica. So it's the seat, right? It's the saddle. And so this image isn't quite tilted forward enough where we can see all of these structures, but we can see Ross. Okay, so sella turcica is going to be in red here. And then we have these three foramen, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum. Okay, so we see foramen rotundum, right? And foramen ovale is very oval shaped. So foramen rotundum over here, and foramen ovale, okay, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum. Okay, so foramen spinosum. Okay, we can also see foramen lacierum. So again, that's right where your feet would hang down if you were sitting in the sella turcica. So we'll go ahead and look at that structure. Okay, so again, if we're sitting in sella turcica, our feet are going to go right through this foramen here. So this is foramen lacierum. Okay, so the only two that we haven't talked about that we just looked at on the map are the optic canal and the superior orbital fissure. So to see that, you have to tilt the skull a little bit forward so you can look under the lesser wing. Okay, so remember this sort of shelf-like structure up here, this is the lesser wing, and we're going to be looking under that. So let's look under there. Okay, so now this upper right image, we're again looking at the sphenoid bone, but now we've tilted it forward so we can look under the lesser wing. So we're looking for the optic canal and superior orbital fissure. Remember, we already saw the superior orbital fissure from the front, so if it's easier for you to find it again from the front and just put something through it, that is a great way to start learning these structures, right? Put something through the foramen and see where it comes out on the other side. Okay, so here is our sella turcica. And then let's do our optic canal in dark blue. So our optic canal, we now look under. We have these two little holes here. So these are the optic canals, and the superior orbital fissure will circle in purple. Okay, so superior orbital fissure are these grooves under the lesser wing. So now we can see that there's a groove here. Okay, so two more structures of the sphenoid bone, the medial and lateral pterygoid, and to see those we have to look at an inferior view. The remaining two structures of the sphenoid bone are the medial and lateral pterygoid processes. Okay, so if we look at the inferior view of the skull, if you're looking at this would be the roof of the mouth, and you come all the way to the back, oops, a little too far back. If you come all the way to the back, there are going to be these leg-like projections that sort of meet up with the roof of the mouth there. So these are the pterygoid processes, okay, and they're actually hanging down off of the sphenoid bone. So if we increase the magnification and look at an image of this, we can see that, okay, so here is a pterygoid. So the medial pterygoid is going to be closer to the midline. It's going to be medial. So it's going to be this process right here. And then the lateral pterygoid is obviously going to be the lateral portion of this whole process. Okay, so the lateral pterygoid is right here. So these two ridges together make up the pterygoid process. The lateral one is the lateral pterygoid, and the medial one is the medial pterygoid. Our last cranial bone is the ethmoid bone. Okay, so the ethmoid bone is going to be anterior, so towards the front when we're looking into the skull, so looking at a superior view. Okay, so here we have the ethmoid bone highlighted, so you can see just where it is. And it's very small, sort of right in the center of the anterior portion of the cranium. Okay, so here is our ethmoid bone. And we can also see pieces of the ethmoid bone when we're looking from an anterior view. Okay, so over in the upper right image, we can see highlighted in blue where we can see the ethmoid bone. So there are 4 structures. Okay, 2 we're going to see on a superior view, and 2 we're going to see from the anterior view. So we'll take a look at those. The first 2 structures of the ethmoid bone that we're going to look at inside the skull. So we're looking in, right at the ethmoid bone. Okay, so on the image you can see that we have magnified the ethmoid bone. So if we look at this upper right image, the first structure we're going to see is the crista galli. And the crista galli is this really sharp, pointed structure, this point right in the middle of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so a lot of times it will be sticking up and it'll look sort of like a shark fin coming out of the water. Okay, sometimes it's not quite as sharp on the models based off the model that you have, so it might be a little bit smooth, but it'll definitely be a bump sort of right in the middle of that bone. Then the next structure we can see from this view is the cribriform plate. Okay, and the cribriform plate is surrounding the crista galli. Okay, so it's the superior portion of the ethmoid bone, and it's surrounding this pointed structure sticking out of it. There's usually a bunch of little holes inside the structure, and those are where our olfactory nerves stick through to pick up our sense of smell. Okay, so what we smell is going to be stimulating those nerves. All right, so before we look at those second 2 structures of the ethmoid bone, I'm going to go through another map. Okay, so the next 2 structures we can see by looking into the nose from an anterior view, but we can also see 2 of the facial bones in there. Okay, so we'll start with the 2 ethmoid bone structures. Okay, so if you look into the nose, there we go. You can see sort of a line going straight down the center, dividing that into left and right. And then you see 4 bumps. Okay, so 4 lateral bumps, or 4 bumps on the side, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. So that's what I've drawn in this image here. So that division, that septum there, that's dividing the nose into left and right is actually 2 different bones. So the top half is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so that was one of our structures, perpendicular plate. So it's the top half of that septum. And then the other structure of the ethmoid bone are the middle nasal concha. And these are the lateral masses on the top half of the nose. Okay, so middle nasal concha. Okay, so then when we look at the lower half, and we'll look at these right after the ethmoid bone when we move on to the facial bones, the bottom half of that septum is a bone, an independent bone, called the vomer. Okay, and then the lateral masses on the bottom are the inferior nasal concha. Okay, and these are their own bones. Okay, inferior nasal concha. The middle concha are part of the ethmoid bone, and the inferior nasal concha are their own bones. Okay, so just to wrap that up and review what we just talked about, we have 2 final structures of the ethmoid bone, so the perpendicular plate. Okay, so again, this is going to be seen when we're looking into the nose, so an anterior view, and it's the superior half of this septum here. Okay, so this bone right here, this portion of the ethmoid bone that's hanging down, this is the perpendicular plate. And then also on the ethmoid bone, we have the middle nasal concha. Okay, so we'll find those in red and circle them. Okay, so remember these are the top bumps that you can see looking into the nose. Okay, so here we have the middle nasal concha. Okay, so now we are finished with the cranial bones, and we're going to move on to the facial bones. Okay, so a lot of the facial bones are paired, meaning there's 2 of them, 1 on each side. So although 14 seems a lot of them are paired, so this will probably be faster than the cranial section of the skull. So we already did 2 of these bones, the vomer and the inferior nasal concha. So just recall that the vomer is one independent bone. You can't really see that color. Here we go. And it's the inferior portion of this septum when you look into the nose. Okay, so this is the vomer. And then just like in the drawing, our inferior nasal concha, these are those lateral masses when we're looking into the nose, and they're inferior, right? So they are the inferior of the 4 bumps in there. Okay, so inferior nasal concha. The next bone we're going to look at is the maxillary bone, or the cheekbones. We have 2 maxillary bones, and these compose the cheek and portion of the roof of the mouth. Okay, so we can see this bone both by looking at an anterior view, okay, so sort of here, making up the cheeks, or looking at an inferior view, okay, that's bring theirs to hold the mandible on, but making up this portion of the roof of the mouth. So again, the bone has been highlighted on this image, and we can see the 2 structures. So we'll go ahead and identify them. One structure is the infraorbital foramen. Okay, so we looked at a supraorbital foramen, which was above the eye. So now infra means below, orbital talking about the orbit, and foramen meaning hole. So there are 2 holes here under the eye, and these are the infraorbital foramen. Okay, then our next structure is the incisive foramen. Okay, and this is going to be located on an inferior view, and it's right behind the 2 front teeth. Okay, so if you're looking at the inferior view, you can see the roof of the mouth, and there's a hole here right behind the 2 front teeth. That is the incisive foramen. Moving along, we have the palatine bones. So palatine, think about palate, right? If you have to cleanse your palate, you're drinking water after you've had food in your mouth. Okay, so these are going to be on the roof of the mouth at the very posterior aspect. So remember, the anterior portion is still the maxillary bone that we were just looking at, and that's about the anterior 2/3, but the posterior 1/3 is composed of 2 little bones called the palatine bones. So here they are highlighted in this image from APR. And we have one structure to identify in the greater palatine bones, and that is the greater palatine foramen. And these are going to be on the lateral side of the bones, and they're just 2 little holes on the lateral side of the palatine bone. So you can see coming through here we have a nerve and an artery. So this is the greater palatine nerve and the greater palatine artery going through the greater palatine foramen. Moving on, we have 2 nasal bones. So there are no structures on the nasal bones, we just have to be able to identify them. And they're 2 little rectangular bones that make up the bridge of the nose. So if you look closely here, you can see that there are 2 of them. So 1 and 2. And again, this isn't really doing the best job showing that there's 2, but we have 1 and 2 nasal bones making up the bridge of the nose there. Our next facial bone is the zygomatic bone, and again we have 2 of them, one on each side of the face. So the zygomatic bone is going to be this little bone that makes up the posterior and lateral side of the orbit. Okay, so right here on the skull. So you can see this both anterior and around to the side. And the zygomatic bone has this little process coming off of it that's going to connect with a process coming off of the temporal bone. Okay, so we have this structure here, and this is the structure we need to identify called the zygomatic arch. Okay, so if you're looking at your skull, you can sort of, right, you can see here, it's this hook on the side of the face. So you can put both your fingers sort of through this arch, this bony structure, and that is the zygomatic arch. There we go. Okay, so it's just a process of the temporal bone and process of the zygomatic bone coming together to form this arch. Moving on, we have 2 lacrimal bones. So the lacrimal bones are going to be lateral to the maxillary bone and sort of sit right in the medial corner of the orbit. Okay, so if we look, we can see our nasal bones that are right here, making up the bridge of the nose. And then the maxillary bone, which comes up and down here. Okay, so maxillary bone. And then you can see highlighted in blue are those little rectangular bones lateral to the maxilla, and those are the lacrimal bones. Okay, so in this other image, we have a little bit better view of that medial corner of the orbit. So here we can see this really small, just rectangular bone called the lacrimal bone. All right, now we've reached the mandible. So I have a drawing of the mandible, sort of a lateral view, and we can see there's a more vertical region, this more horizontal region where the teeth are coming out, and some foramen. Okay, so the mandible is the lower jaw of the skull, and we're going to go through all the structures. We're going to draw them out first, and then we'll look at the image. Okay, so first let's name the regions of the mandible. So this more horizontal portion that's going up towards the temporal bone is the ramus. And then this more horizontal portion where you're going to find the teeth articulating is the mandibular body. There are 2 foramen in the mandible, so we can see one of them from this view, from this lateral view. If you're looking from the front, if you go just lateral to the chin on either side, there's going to be a foramen. Okay, so remember from Unit 1, the region of the chin is the mental region, so these are going to be the mental foramen. And then lastly, we can name these 2 processes coming off the ramus. So the more posterior, rounded, larger process is the condylar process. And then the more anterior, more pointed process is the coronoid process. Okay, so let's go to the image and identify the rest of the structures. Okay, so now let's just review those structures that we have already talked about. Okay, so our mental foramen, that's going to be this hole here up close to the chin. The mandibular body is going to be this sort of horizontal region. The mandibular ramus is going to be this more vertical region. The condylar process is going to be the more posterior, rounded process. And then the coronoid process is going to be the more anterior, pointed projection. Okay, so you'll see that we have 3 more structures. Okay, so the mandibular notch is going to be this U-shaped structure between the coronoid and condylar process. So we can see right here, this indentation, this is the mandibular notch. Okay, and then we have a mandibular foramen. Okay, so this is our other foramen, and it's back here. Oh, you can't really see that. Let me change colors. Okay, it's back here on the inside of the ramus. So if you look from a posterior view, so this is anterior, if we turn it around and look from a posterior view, you can see this foramen on the back of the ramus. Okay, so that is the mandibular foramen. And then lastly is our mandibular symphysis. Okay, so the mandibular symphysis is the center portion of the mandible. Okay, so up front and center. So if we were to look, would be right here on our mandible. There we go. Okay, so right where, there we go, there's sort of like an indent even right there. That's the mandibular symphysis. Okay, so we can circle that here as well. Okay, so that wraps up the mandible. We're going to finish this week's lab lesson up talking about the sutures. So a suture is an immovable joint, so it's going to be the articulation point between 2 of the bones of the skull, and we're going to name the sutures. Okay, so first I'm going to label the bones of the skull on both images so we can sort of orientate ourselves. This is going to be the frontal bone, right? Both of these are the parietal bone, and then way back here we have the occipital bone. Okay, and this is a posterior view on the left, so this is going to be the occipital bone and the 2 parietal bones. Okay, so this is the posterior view, and then the image on the right is the superior view. Okay, so first the lambdoidal suture. The lambdoidal suture is the articulation between the occipital bone and the parietal bones. So if you can see here, this articulation, it's fairly small on this one because we're looking from the top. So we just see the very top of the suture. Okay, so if we look at our skull, okay, we're going to look at the posterior aspect. And here we have this suture. Okay, so this is the lambdoidal suture. Coming up, the articulation between the 2 parietal bones. This is going to be the sagittal suture. Okay, and remember sagittal is dividing something into left and right half, so the sagittal suture is dividing the skull into left and right. Okay, so here or here is the sagittal suture, and then we have a coronal suture. Okay, so the coronal suture is dividing the skull into front and back. So it's the articulation point between the parietal bones and the frontal bone. So you can see that. Or if you're looking at your skull from an anterior view, it's going to be that first suture that you come in contact with right here. Okay, so this is the coronal suture. So the squamosal suture we're going to see from a lateral view, so let's look at that, and that will wrap up the skull this week. So the very last structure we're going to look at is the squamosal suture, and this is the articulation point between the temporal bone and the parietal bone. Okay, so if we look at the lateral side of our skull, okay, here's that temporal bone, and you can see where it's articulating with the parietal bone. There we go. Okay, so if we label that, recall that this is our temporal bone, and up here's our parietal bone. So in blue, that's our squamosal suture. Okay, so squamous means flat or squished, and this portion of the temporal bone is very flat. It's actually called the squamous portion of the temporal bone. So that's where we get this term, calling this the squamosal suture. Okay, so that wraps up the skull. Next week we'll look at the rest of the axial skeleton, and then the following week we'll do appendicular. Okay, so to be studying for this, remember to use your structures list. It's best to use your skull. Looking at the structures and touching those structures is going to help you significantly. And then you can also use APR. It can highlight all the structures that are on the structures list. Okay, with any questions, please email me